You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hello and welcome to WCAT, the Catholic Bookworm. I'm Kiki Latimer. I'm your host today. And I have with me Miles Christie, who's written a very interesting novel called Moment. It's got an interesting cover, too. I love this book. It's a lot of fun to read, very interesting. So we are going to have an hour of discussion, hopefully, with Miles. And so welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
Would you like to start us with a prayer?
Sure. Something simple as a Hail Mary?
Sure.
Okay. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. Blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So why don't you start, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Well, I've been in publishing a long time, in various capacities as an editor, as a copy editor, proofreader. I've done a lot of developmental editing as well. And I got started in the museum publishing world. Before I started in publishing, I actually worked in television briefly. And then started working on what I would call small run projects as a publisher of nonfiction mainly. And this book marks the first foray into fiction under a new imprint. Well,
it's sort of fiction.
Yeah, sort of fiction. That's a good way to put it.
It's almost like historical fiction or present-day
scientific fiction. Yeah. Or not science fiction, but science. Yeah.
So tell us, tell us a little bit about the book. I loved it. I'm very interested to give it to my grandsons who are, first of all, I know they like graphic novels. Right. By graphic novels, in case people don't know what we mean they have like lots of illustrations. So I know young people particularly love these kinds of things.
Yeah, I didn't write it that way intentionally, actually. Yep. I started the book 14 years ago, actually. Yeah. I tried to write it as a regular narrative fiction, and it just wasn't coming out right. It was a completely different plot line, different characters. And then I started to imagine it as something graphical or something that would happen in a classroom context that would present a dialogue and use a notebook to illustrate what that dialogue, what that context or setting was like. And I worked on it slowly but surely for years. It involved a lot of research. The book, as you know, contains a lot of scientific references. Yeah. But I never really could get a good run on it until the end of 2020. I really started to focus on it, to take time out of my day job or away from my job and family to get it done. And it took me about a year to knock it out at that point. And I rewrite heavily. So every time I would sit down to write, I would go back to the beginning. And the book isn't very long, so that wasn't difficult to do necessarily, but it was I guess August or September of 2020 that I focused exclusively on it. Okay. And then,
well, it's an interesting story because we're certainly seeing this story play out on college campuses across the country. I know several professors. So the story is about a professor who speaks his mind on the life issue, on the issue of abortion.
Right.
And the reaction of various students in the classroom from good to horrible. You know, and the question of, do you have freedom of speech on a college campus and in a classroom? It certainly touched home for me because I worked with Professor Stephen Schwartz at the University of Rhode Island for many years as his assistant, and in an ethics class where the last 6 weeks of the class was the abortion issue.
Okay.
And the reason one could do that at a secular university was because we presented the pro-life side and the pro-choice side.
Gotcha.
The strongest arguments on both sides, and because we could claim to be fair, and we were fair, we gave the strongest arguments and the strongest reasons and presented the strongest quote unquote propaganda materials from both sides. Sure. We were allowed to, he taught it for 40 years and I was with him, or I'm sorry, about 50 years, and I was with him for probably the last 10. Okay. And so we did this at a secular university as we watched, a huge number of students become pro-life by the end of the 6 weeks.
Yeah, that's great.
And we, usually about 10%, we always say 10% were very pro-life, about 10% of the class was very pro-choice, and the 80% in the middle were what I called pro-choice by default. They didn't really know the issue, so they were just culturally pro-choice, but didn't really have a stake in the issue. So the attitudes of people in your book, I could relate to. No one ever got violent or tried to shut us down because we gave both sides. But in your book, you have this array of people, from those who agree with the professor to those who don't necessarily agree but feel that freedom of speech is still important, which is interesting. That the whole concept of I don't agree with what you say, but I would defend to the death your right to say it.
Yeah.
And that concept in our culture is certainly gone.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think at the time I started it, the freedom of speech was, let's say, more embraced than it is now. I don't even know if the setting in the book is realistic now, because the dialogue is allowed to happen.
The dialogue what?
Is allowed to happen. I just don't know. Obviously, you brought up the scenario at Rhode Island, but it seemed like yours was a more thoughtful, gradual approach. And here the debate just sparks.
Right.
And you have people walk out, obviously, but still the class continues. I just don't know what that would be like in a current classroom.
I know professors that have been gotten rid of because they've held Judeo-Christian values. They're teaching the classics, and concepts either about abortion or euthanasia or homosexuality or contraception have come up, and they've defended Judeo-Christian values, and they lose their tenure.
Yeah.
or their life is made pretty miserable, and while they're not, it doesn't get as immediately violent as it does in your novel. It certainly gets unpleasant enough that they have to leave a well-loved position.
Yeah. No, I don't envy anyone in that position.
So what made you in the end choose the graphical format?
The book just came to me that way, and we brought in 2 illustrators to do the work. One who did the doodles, as I mentioned, and then the other who did the depictions of the setting or the scene. And then we had a designer come in and do the talk bubbles. No one is ever named in the book except the professor, so all the characters are unnamed. And so we use the talk bubbles to differentiate the characters, and each one represents a color. Each character is represented by a color.
It works very well.
Thanks. Yeah, and people felt like the talk bubbles looked like text messages, which is how younger people are used to communicating. But that wasn't intentional for me. That was just something the designer came up with. Someone remarked.
It works very well.
Thanks. Yeah, I can't take credit for it. But, yeah, so, the discussion the characters I wanted to be as realistic as possible, but you have two different characters on the ends of the spectrum. And, obviously the other characters in the middle. And so I think that reflects the majority, as you said, the people that are pro-choice by default.
Yep.
And they're able to see both ends, or at least the end that the public hardly gets to see,
Great.
Which is what actually happens in an abortion.
Great. Yeah, a lot of people, it was very common in the classroom for, college students to believe that abortion was only allowed in the United States in the first trimester, which obviously is not the case. And they were shocked to learn that it was legal up to and including the moment of birth. They had no idea of that.
Yeah.
They had very little knowledge that you bring in of the status of the being in the womb, that there were fingers and toes and heartbeat very, 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 very early.
Right.
Certainly by the time early abortions are done, everything's in place. They had no idea of those simple biological scientific facts.
Right. And to me, obviously the late terms they seem more violent, and they involve more physical aspects that we can relate to because you have a fully formed human, but seems just as awful at the very earliest stages, where there's still a growing, developing being that is just as human as a 10-year-old.
Right.
So,
and just as much of a personal being. It was very interesting. A lot of times we heard the expression, "It doesn't look human." And we would explain, "Oh no, it does look human. That's what you look like."
That's what you look like at that age. Yeah.
So, if you were a scientist and we showed you a baby embryo and an alligator embryo, a scientist would say, "Oh no, that's the human one over there."
Right.
That's what you look like.
Yeah. An 80-year-old doesn't look like a 2-year-old.
Right.
It doesn't look like a 15-year-old. So.
Right. Exactly.
But it was fascinating looking at some of these texts and how they frame what a preborn child is. You see the words or the phrase "products of conception," so they won't even say. They don't ever refer to it as a baby because that would personalize it too much. But product of conception is about as sterile as you can be in describing something. I mean, we're all products of conception, but we don't refer to ourselves as that. So,
and if someone has a miscarriage, you never hear, "Oh, they lost their product of conception."
Right.
Or even they lost the embryo or they lost the fetus.
Yeah, exactly.
She lost the baby.
Absolutely.
And when it's wanted, she lost the baby. Years ago, when I was a teenager, I was pro-choice. I wasn't Catholic, first of all, and then I wasn't.
Okay.
I was pro-choice until I was one of those default pro-choice people that walked into Steve's class in 1980 and became pro-life pretty quickly. But I remember there was a show called, goodness, it was one of those family shows like 8 is Enough or something, and the young parent who had just gotten married gets pregnant and has the miscarriage. And so it was one of the first times miscarriage was discussed on public television. And I remember one of the younger siblings was talking with the mother, and she said, "I feel really sad. When do you think it becomes a baby? Because we're all talking about she lost the baby." And the answer was, I think it becomes a baby when we start to think of it as a baby.
Yeah.
And I remember as a teenager thinking, oh, that sounds very charming.
Yeah. It's all
When we
relative.
start to think of it, your humanity depends on when I start to think of you as a human person. And years later, realizing what a horrible idea this is, that you become human when I think you're human. If I want you, if I like you as a neighbor, then I can treat you as a human. But if I don't like you, I can go over and shoot you.
Right.
Or if I don't want you there, you're a wanted neighbor. But if I decide I really don't like you or have some reason, I can just go over and kill you and get rid of you. Because I just decide you're not a person. So it's very interesting, this idea of product, words matter, product of conception. Well, yeah, that's what we are.
Well, the obvious irony of that is that many of the people who are sympathetic to others that are unwanted, they would argue for the worthiness of people that are unwanted, but in the context of the abortion debate, unwanted is acceptable.
Right.
So, there are a lot of contradictions, obviously. Yeah. But my point at the end of the day is, this is a human being, it's alive, and you can't assign all these arbitrary characteristics to decide what makes someone a person and what makes someone disposable. So that should appeal to anyone, regardless of whether you're agnostic or atheist. There are plenty of atheists, actually, that are pro-life because their thinking is consistent.
Right, it's consistent. The most famous one, of course, was Nat Hentoff.
Oh, yeah.
He was very pro-life.
I'm a fan.
And his reason for being pro-life was he felt, this is the only life you get. This is it. There's no heaven. There's nothing. There's no afterlife. There's nothing beyond here. This is it. So to take this away from somebody, he thought was a horrible crime. To deprive someone of the only life that you get, this amazing thing called life, to take that away from someone, he thought was deplorable.
Right.
So that was without any belief in God. In fact, it was because he didn't believe in God. It was interesting.
Right. Yeah. And he was reviled for it. Like his colleagues,
I'm sure,
ostracized him. But that didn't change his point of view, which was great.
So you did a lot of research.
I did. And I'm no scientist. In fact, I hated biology and every other science that applies. But I just buried myself in different texts. And of course, when you look through citation, one text leads to another. And so I ended up working with a lot of embryology texts that were in, many subsequent editions. So it was easy from that standpoint. I guess there were a few books that were by social scientists, but I really tried to stick with the facts. And, they speak for themselves. It's fairly obvious that, when a human life starts, the argument of why it should be protected maybe is separate. But to me, it starts and ends there. The life begins.
Interesting. Roe v. Wade was the whole abortion issue was the first time that human being and person were divided. Before that, if you were human, you were a person. If you were a person, you were human. And those two terms have been divided for the purpose of saying, well, yes, it's human, it's got human DNA, but it's not a person until it functions as a person. Consciousness, the desire to continue in existence. So there was this division of that, which again was a use of words to sort of pull things apart in a way that they had never been pulled apart before.
Right. And then there's viability too. I don't know how extensive that comes into play in Roe v. Wade, but that's one that drives me crazy, because a 2-year-old is not viable. Neither is someone in a nursing home. It's why they're in a nursing home.
Right. Or a newborn baby.
Or a newborn baby.
Yeah.
So it's all arbitrary.
Yeah.
The criteria to define what those terms mean, viable in person.
And viability is ultimately just a matter of technology.
Right.
Generally speaking, I mean, viability now is at 20 weeks. Years ago, it was probably 30 weeks. And that's being pushed back. So they know the viability ideas. Well, first of all, the idea that you're a human being, you're become a person because you can survive on your own, like you're saying, is absurd.
Right. Right. But yeah, science is making it harder. Advancements in technology are making it harder for people to argue.
Right.
The idea that this isn't a human.
Right. These lines that get drawn.
Right. So, the novel, the reason I chose that as a context, fiction was familiar to me, and I think it was better to illustrate than just simply to make the points using text and evidence. And it seemed like it was a great combination to pull those together.
Yeah. How did you decide on the college classroom?
I had taken I was an English major. When you're an English major, you're not very good at science. You take classes like contemporary biological issues, things that are more issue oriented, because the science is over your head. And so I thought contemporary bioethics would be something generic enough that most people could relate to as a class. And in a classroom offers the opportunity also for people to debate, especially maybe like a liberal arts environment. So
it works very well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Both what they say, which I think is very realistic, and the doodling I loved.
Okay. I'm glad you liked it.
The passing of notes kind of thing. When the pandemic started, I was teaching a sort of a homeschooling ethics course, which I'd been teaching in person and with teenagers, and I had to switch to the Zoom. And so I had about 10 kids I was teaching, and they're immediately more familiar with the technology than I am. And two of my grandsons were in the class, and so I'm teaching like 14 to 16-year-olds, and I'm having a really hard time keeping their attention.
Oh, I bet.
And then at one point, my grandson says to me, "Grandma, you need to turn off the chat room."
Oh.
I was like, "What chat room?" He's like, "Well, if you look on the side of your computer, there's a chat room where we can all chat." Right. And so the whole time I was lecturing, they'd been just chatting away.
Chatting, yeah.
You have to turn that off.
Right. I don't know if this informed the story or not, but I was in a class having a written dialogue with another student while the teacher was lecturing. This is in college. And the teacher caught us, and he said something about it. I was pretty embarrassed by it, because here I am, probably 20 years old, passing notes with another student.
Passing notes electronically. Right?
Yeah. But it was still some of that interaction allows for, obviously humor and creativity.
It does.
So yeah, I think it probably still happens, but maybe in a more electronic manner these days.
It's almost like in any situation of communication, there's always different layers of it that are going on at different times. And especially, I think, with young people, the classroom is the place to doodle. It's the place to pass notes one way or another. There's always more going on than is on the surface.
Absolutely.
And so the book brings that out very well.
Oh, thank you.
It's fun, because I was like, oh yeah, that's what they'd be doing.
Yeah. No, we, to have someone whose style lends itself to doodling. I guess everybody doodles at the end of the day, but an art student, that's one of the characters. His doodles are a little better than most would be. So I did decide to make that student an art student for that reason.
Yeah. I think everyone does doodle. Yeah. When I was little, I doodled Santa Claus faces. That was my favorite thing.
Okay.
And we waited for the bus stop at this business that was, I guess it was an aquarium, and it had very shiny walls that you could write on with a nickel, so I had doodled all these Santa Claus faces. Okay. And then the owner called my parents and said several of the kids were in trouble for doodling on the walls, And of course I said, oh, I didn't do that. I didn't doodle. Not me.
They were trying to figure out who was into Santa Claus.
My parents went up, and there were my infamous Santa Claus faces all over the wall. Yeah. So I had to go on Saturday morning. I had to go and scrub the wall. Okay. And that was the end of my graffiti days. So I think the doodling is fun in the book because it is a universal thing.
Thanks. Yeah. I can't take credit, as I said, for the doodles, but it did. The subject matter of the book is obviously very intense and serious.
It's very intense.
The doodles sort of lighten and also kind of normalize the environment. And
who was your audience that you were originally? I mean, who are you hoping to reach with this? To me, it's young people, but was that your plan?
Not originally. I think I just imagined the story, but certainly, after the fact, it made a lot of sense. You have all these illustrations and colorful talk bubbles, and graphic novels are very popular among younger audiences. And obviously, the context is college classroom. And so I do think it's friendly to that audience, and that's also a formative time when opinions are being shaped.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned your perspective changing at that time. And so I think the ideal time for somebody to have the book is maybe sophomore, junior year of high school.
Yep.
If I had to guess, but I don't know that I really customized it for that age group. It just came out that way.
I mean, I'm 64 and I loved it. So.
Oh, thanks.
But I'm anxious to give it to my 14 and 16-year-old grandsons to see what they think of it.
Yeah, and we've actually been kind of testing it with that audience and generally getting a good response. And I think, let's say, organizations that want to use the book, they see it as a tool, as a vehicle to teach kids about abortion and help them understand what it is. Because they just hear noise and they hear what their friends say, and people generally avoid conflict and they're more likely to go along to get along. And so they never really question the reality. And that's, I think, what the book at least attempts to do, is to present the reality. And it's not meant to be, it's funny, I wrote the book and I think it has upset some people, but in no way was it meant to be in the reader's face. There's no graphic violence of what happens with an abortion, even though it is explained. But again, I use texts that were written by, in some cases, abortionists to explain what happens. So in fact, I used to
calls it the gentle emptying of the womb.
Oh yeah, that is a joke.
Yeah, amusing.
So, but yeah, I think, it would be jarring for people, and I think it might make people question whether it is readable for a young audience. But we have to see things. We have to understand what ugliness happens. When when we're not necessarily directly exposed to it.
Yeah, it's tough to know when to introduce young teenagers to the concept of abortion, when you even let them know such a thing exists. It's not a topic you want to be sharing with 8-year-olds, hopefully, I've been in this, dealt with this topic both as an author and as executive director of a pregnancy agent, a crisis pregnancy agency. I've taught it in the ethics class. So I've kind of been inundated with it for the last 40 years. And it's a sad topic. It's just,
it is.
And when to even let children know that, this reality exists is very delicate.
The only thing is, I feel like if they do understand as early as possible, then it becomes unthinkable. It's so outrageous that you would never allow your conscience to accept it. And I think that's maybe part of the problem, is that we've been so careful not to display it that people don't appreciate the horror of it.
I had an interesting experience probably, about 25 years ago now. I was asked to go and talk in Narragansett, Rhode Island, to a confirmation class, a Catholic confirmation class, about the topic of prenatal life and abortion. And because it was a Catholic class, I assumed they would be pro-life. And there were two, I was going with a friend, a gentleman, and there were two people there that ran the confirmation class. So there were 4 adults and I'd say about maybe 12 students about to be confirmed. And the first thing we did was we showed, pictures of prenatal life, and made it obvious this is a baby from the moment of conception. And then very quickly we were literally shouted down by 12 teenagers who insisted that a woman had a right to her body, she had a right to abortion. It was a blob of tissue. And, even though we had shown the beautiful prenatal life photographs from Life magazine, which I'm sure you're familiar with, we had 12 teenagers that we could literally not control, who told us a woman had a right to her body and an abortion. And after an hour and a half of, trying to get a word in edgewise, I finally said, I'm done. Yeah. And the only thing we hadn't done up until that point was we had with us what's called the Life or Death brochure, which has graphic pictures of abortions in it. And so I said, I'm done here. I'm just going to hand out the Life or Death brochure and get in my car and go home. Yeah. I couldn't believe this was a Catholic confirmation class. But anyway, so I handed out, I started packing out my stuff and my slides and the whole thing and handed out the Life or Death brochure. And for the first time in an hour and 45 minutes, complete silence fell in the room.
Wow.
Complete silence. Not a whisper, not a sound. For like a good 5 minutes, these kids in total silence looked at these actual photographs of aborted babies. Mm-hmm. And then in a stage whisper, this one girl said, the one who had been most vehement about a woman's right to an abortion and her body, said, nobody should do this to a baby.
Wow. Well, it's good you hung around.
And they were all like incomplete. When they saw the reality of abortion, all the slogans went away. It's fascinating to me. Even though they had seen the prenatal life pictures, that didn't bring out the horror of abortion. I had seen the prenatal life pictures in high school, and I was pro-choice until I saw the Life or Death brochure. And then I'd had my own conversion of nobody should do this to a baby. And I liken it to if I were to show someone a picture of like Jewish people happy and smiling, that I don't think the human brain naturally conjures up horror. That's my belief. You could, by showing you a beautiful picture of Jewish people, your brain would not understand Auschwitz.
Right.
It just doesn't go there. Even though you're said, well, these people died there, your brain doesn't conjure up the pictures that we've seen of Auschwitz. And I think it's the same with abortion. People don't understand it because they haven't seen it, and the imagination cannot conjure it up by itself.
Yeah, that is amazing. I guess I wouldn't have necessarily guessed that you would have that experience, but it makes perfect sense. And there's nothing sensational about showing images like that, because that's just what it is.
Right.
You're not embellishing.
Right. It was just this is the reality. Now, when we in the classroom at the secular university, we also handed out that life or death brochure. And the only way we got away with doing that without, somebody yelling, you're pushing your Catholic beliefs or anything. It was like, no, this is the facts. We also handed out a brochure that had been put out probably by Planned Parenthood that showed dead women who had self-inflicted abortions who had died. But we explained that this self-infliction of an abortion, each one of those pictures contained what the other picture showed, a dead baby.
Right.
And that this had been a sad, terrible choice. So we showed both. And we also gave people the option to not see if, occasionally you had, it was not uncommon to have somebody in the classroom who had an abortion.
Okay.
So they were given the option not to look at these pictures, but almost everybody did look at them, and it did change people's hearts and minds, because the reality is horrible.
Right. And this may be off topic, but I know classrooms used to watch the silent screen. Is that something that happens anymore, or is that considered too?
I don't know if it's still shown. I mean, I saw it when it came out.
Yeah.
It was very difficult to watch.
Because that was an abortionist had produced that, or someone who had converted to becoming pro-life was the one who, I think, produced it. But I just don't think, you don't hear it mentioned as much.
I haven't heard about it in a long time. I don't know. But I do remember when it came out. Yeah.
And again, it is just what happened. It's not something that's contrived or embellished. So.
Right. It's interesting. When the pictures of Auschwitz first came out, and the Holocaust, there was a big push against showing them, that it was considered sensational. But people said, no, it's not sensational. It's just the reality.
It's just reality.
This is what's going on, and people need to know what's going on. I think when people, I have friends in Vietnam who, priests who go once a week to the abortion mill, and they get a truckload of babies, dead babies, and they bring them back to the church, and they wash them and dress them and put them in little coffins and bury them with a mass. And that's their ministry. So they get about 200 babies a week from, this big to this big. And I have pictures of them, and I've shown them to people. It's like,
wow.
With their little hats on and their little hands put together, and they're dressed and they're washed.
Wow.
But you can tell they've been brutally murdered.
Right.
And I posted them once. I've posted them on Facebook. And at one point I showed a picture of one of the babies to a friend, and the person said something to the effect of, you have no right to show a picture of your own baby trying to make a point about abortion. And I said, oh, this isn't my baby. This was a little aborted baby in Vietnam that's just been dressed and is about to be buried. And that was the end of the discussion. That person left the discussion.
Okay.
Because it got too real.
Yeah.
But when you see all those little tiny caskets with all these little teeny weeny babies.
That's amazing. What a ministry.
Yeah, I don't know how they do it. God bless them.
Yeah, absolutely.
I couldn't do it. You know, I've had one baby I had to fish out of a toilet for a dear friend of mine and have a mass done and buried from a miscarriage, and
right.
That was tough. Yeah,
I bet.
Once in a lifetime, that was enough for me.
Yeah.
I was heartbreaking for both of us. So I couldn't, these men who do this on a weekly basis and bathe and dress these little aborted people, very sad.
Yeah, I'd like to see a link or something.
I could send you that.
That would be great.
Yeah, it's quite amazing.
Yeah.
So I think your book is very important especially for young people, because obviously they're of the age where they're making pregnancy decisions, sexual decisions, marriage decisions, relationship, contraception decisions, all that. So even though, I loved your book, I do think it's more geared because of the graphic design to young people. And I think that's wonderful.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Thank you. The challenge is I'm open to suggestions. I'd like to get it into people's hands in mass, as a way to, make sure that the message is read and heard. So,
I know Matthew Kelly has gotten his books out, in piles of books that he, into churches. Someone in our church purchased 200 copies at some point of one of his first books that came out, and everybody got a copy. So maybe finding some way through
schools, I think, would be the best.
CCD programs.
Yeah. Sorry if I'm getting off on a tangent, but schools are really ultimately the goal.
Yeah.
Or at least programs that cater to young people. Because the retail market isn't as friendly to books like this.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. When it comes to marketing books, I'm not your person.
No, I should have a better idea here.
But Sebastian might be.
Yeah, no, I think he does. So, but yeah, no, I appreciate you taking the time to read it. And
it's wonderful, and I highly recommend it, especially for young people. I would say what 12, 13 and up?
Yeah, I think so. I was thinking a little older, but certainly there are kids that are precocious and, can grasp what's happening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with what they're exposed to on the internet these days,
very true.
By the time they're 13, 14, they're exposed to everything. And
no, that's a great point.
Anything that they can, it's a sad culture right now. So, having something where they're pushed to think about things, think about the consequences of things. And to me, your book, while it was hugely about the abortion issue, to me was also very much about the freedom of speech issue.
Right.
Can you have a disagreement without killing somebody over it? Can you agree to disagree?
Right.
Can you have a civil discussion? I think it was just as much about that as the issue that you chose to write about. It seems certainly with the internet, Facebook chats, that people are often not capable of having civil discussions.
Or just even having the discussion. The
Right.
censorship is so extensive.
Right. You can't talk about a whole bunch of things.
Right.
And then if you do, it becomes so about your feelings and not about let's have just a rational discussion.
Right.
Where, even with friends of mine, I've had to say, you're welcome to comment on my Facebook page, but only if you do so nicely.
Right.
I'll have two really close friends who are really decent human beings, but they disagree. And
Right.
they're ready to murder each other on my Facebook page. And it's like, whoa, guys, like you're both, if you were to meet each other, you'd really like each other.
Yeah, and you'd be embarrassed.
Right.
But,
and you'd be embarrassed by how you're reacting right now. And I have one particular friend, he's an amazing guy. He's a wonderful Catholic guy. But wow, he turns into a little street fighter on Facebook. And I've had to say, like, okay, you might want to say something nice before you go for the jugular, because that really helps.
Yeah,
I always try to find something that I like about somebody's argument before I say anything negative.
Right.
It's just helpful.
It's always better to have those discussions face to face, because it's not as easy you're more inclined to be civil. So
yes.
Yeah, social media is, I think, obviously hurt discussion and has hurt discourse.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's tough. It's so many blessings with it, but we as fallen human beings, I think we can take any good technology and manage to mangle it somehow.
Right. It wasn't that way to begin with, I don't think. But yeah.
So, is there anything we've missed that you would like to discuss about the book?
I'm trying to think of anything specific. The scene, I don't know if this spoils it, but the scene at the end that involves violence is really meant to be metaphorical and not necessarily to be sensational or to express that violence is imminent, or that it's a way to it somehow resolves something. In fact, I guess it suggests the opposite. But it maybe is more of a reflection of what how speech is threatened. So, and how that dialogue is becoming more scarce and more volatile.
Mm.
But that doesn't tell you much if you haven't seen the book.
Yeah. So when's the movie coming out? Right?
Movies. Oh, I did want to say about the cover, because I think the cover is kind of interesting. We actually used a blanket, a felt blanket. We photographed it from overhead and twirled it so that there are folds set up so that the baby could be at the center. So that's something I think that came out well. So with the idea that the life is in the balance and that there's this vortex working against life.
On many levels.
Right.
Well, thank you for writing it, and thank the guys who did the illustrations. They're wonderful. They're catchy. They keep your attention, as did the story itself. I think it was a nice collaboration.
I appreciate it. Yeah,
Did you have something else in the wings?
I don't yet. Of course, I have ideas, but don't we all? So
yeah, well, work on them, because I think this was wonderful.
Thank you.
Really,
I appreciate it.
Fascinating piece of work, and I think hopefully we'll get into the hands of our young people.
Yeah, that's my immediate objective.
So buy it for Christmas if you've got young people out there. It's a great, a fascinating Christmas gift, birthday gift. I just highly recommend it.
Okay. Well, thanks, Kiki. I appreciate it.
And it's different, and I was gonna say it's not Calvin and Hobbes, but it's the other, a lot more serious.
Yeah,
but,
it's not beach reading.
I think, my like I said, my grandsons are very into this kind of thing. So I think I'm anxious to give it to them and see what they think of it. I'll let you know.
Great. Well, thanks
You
very
want to
much.
end us into prayer?
Sure. Is an Our Father okay?
Sure.
Okay. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's been
Thank
great.
you.
I've enjoyed it.
Great.
Hope you write another one. I'd like to see you again.
Okay, great. Appreciate you.
All right. God bless.
Go. Take care.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.